I only have partial view up there, so. Oh, okay. This meeting is being recorded, apparently. I just got a big notice on my screen telling me that. Well, thank you. I'm so sorry. Thank you all for coming today. I'm sorry I missed last week's. I was able to read through the materials and watch some of the video highlights. So I wanted to thank you all for making it again here this week. I had the opportunity to do a hike through the blast zone of Mount St. Helens, and as somebody who's never hiked much, it was fantastic. And it made me, I perhaps at 53 might turn into a hiker now, because it was really an amazing day. So I'm sorry to have missed you, but it was a pretty good excuse. Why not? But so, you know, this topic of property tax reform, I know I sent a little video last time and about what an, you know, how this is a topic that we and many generations before us have known what a problem it was. And I'm really excited for us to really not talk structurally, but to talk about it more broadly, to take a more critical lens of what property tax reform is going to mean broadly and more structurally. So we are in this era of such uncertainty and transformation. We need to look at this system much like so many of the systems that we have propped up over the years and ask, okay, who is this working for and who is this not working for as a system? Who is benefiting, who's being harmed, and how indeed is the system that we have, in this case, specifically property tax, how is it contributing to our ability to create a future where everyone really can thrive? Because as we know, bluntly, our property tax system is a mess. It was clumsily written and rewritten. I was just looking back. I'd forgotten about many of the things in the 70s, 80s, where the legislature was clumsily doing work back and forth on it, and it was ballot measure after ballot measure. And then since then, we've made kind of tweaks around the margins, but on the whole, obviously, it's not bringing in enough revenue. It's wildly inconsistent, and it sits on top of a historically racist and anti-Black housing system. So I am really grateful for Commissioner Jayapal's leadership in getting this conversation going. I'm grateful to all of you for being here today and bringing your own insight, stories, and your own expertise to this conversation. So Commissioner Jayapal is going to dive a little bit more into the context of today's panel. But first, I wanted to do a little intro. Let me see. Hang on. I was going to, I don't know if this was the process last time. We're going to ask all the electeds to pop on and introduce yourself. And everybody else, if you're not an elected, would you please pop onto the chat and introduce yourself? Thank you for your screen names. My favorite is when you can tell somebody's been playing some online game or their kid's been using it, and so they pop up with some odd or unusual name. So thank you. If you could go ahead and have your name on the screen as accurate as you can, we appreciate that. But I'd like to go ahead and have and ask all the electeds who are on to just unmute themselves and introduce themselves briefly.
Lori Monis Anderson, representing Senator from East Multnomah County.
And I'm Ginny Burdick. I represent Senate District 18. And Barbara, your audio is very choppy. I wonder, yeah.
Okay, I may take off my headphones then.
Deborah Kafori, I'm your Multnomah County Chair. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'm Jessica Vega Peterson, Multnomah County Commissioner. It's so good to see some of my former colleagues and Legislative Revenue Office people on this call today. I missed you guys.
Oh, Sharon's got to unmute.
There you go. Sharon, as you know, there's always someone. Sharon Myron, Multnomah County Commissioner for District 1, which is all of Multnomah County west of the Willamette River and inner east side south of I-84 and out to Cesar Chavez or 39th.
Awesome. And thanks everybody on the chat chiming in to introduce yourself as well. I think, is that all of our electeds right now? Am I missing anybody?
One more, Mike Coles, elected Lane County Assessor, Tax Collector.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
I like your big room.
Social distancing.
Amen. Fantastic. Okay, all right. I think I'm ready to kick it back to Commissioner Jayapal to get us started on our conversation.
Great, thank you, Majority Leader Smith-Warner. I'm Sushila Jayapal, your Multnomah County Commissioner for District 2, representing North and Northeast Portland. Welcome back. It's good to see you all again. We've got two great panels for you today, and I'm just going to provide a little bit of context to those panels and expand a little bit on what Majority Leader Smith-Warner talked about in terms of the impacts of the structure that we have. So last week, those of you who were here or who watched will remember that our presenters outlined the history of our property tax system, its current structure, and the ways that it impacts Multnomah County. Today, we've got two panels of presenters. The first panel will bring some community voice to this discussion, and the second panel will provide additional information about the impact and implications of the structure in other counties. And as I mentioned last time, we're focusing on Multnomah County because that's where I am and that's where we are, but really this is intended to be a jumping off point for a statewide conversation. So I want to frame the first panel by referring back to the information that Vanessa and Jeff presented at the end of last week's session. If you'll recall, Vanessa showed us that the overall effect of our property tax structure has been felt differently in different parts of Multnomah County. In North and Northeast Portland, in general, the ratio of assessed value to market value is low, resulting in relatively low property taxes. While in outer parts of Portland and Multnomah County, as well as parts of the West Side, in general, the ratio is higher, resulting in relatively high property taxes. This has happened in large part because of the history, the racist history of land ownership and regulation in Portland and Multnomah County. Exclusionary zoning, discrimination, redlining, disinvestment, siting of industrial properties and highways, and more resulted in low property values in predominantly Black neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland. These practices also resulted in relatively low rates of home ownership for Black people and other people of color. In the decades since Measure 50 was adopted, however, a booming economy, pent-up demand in other parts of the city, and reinvestment in these neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland has led to skyrocketing property values and the eastward displacement of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And these were some of the maps that Vanessa showed us at the end of the last session. So the net effect has been, again in general, because there are always exceptions, residents of these gentrified neighborhoods have benefited from the tax structure, while residents of East Portland and East Multnomah County neighborhoods to which BIPOC have been displaced have been disadvantaged. It's important, really important to note that the process of displacement is by no means complete. Black and other people of color continue to live and own homes in North and Northeast Portland, and preventing further displacement is an equity-related value. But again, in general, the effect of the structure has been to exacerbate racial and economic inequity. Communities of color and low-income people who've been displaced to East Portland and East County are paying relatively high property taxes, and at the same time are experiencing economic, educational, health, and environmental disparities that require resources to redress, resources that are constrained by our tax structure. So there are multiple ways in which the current structure preserves and exacerbates inequity. Our first two speakers, Estelle Norris and Allison Spencer, are going to share their experiences as residents of Multnomah County. And our third panelist, Michelle Ruffin, will provide the perspective of an organization that advocates for racial and economic justice and for our communities of color. It's important to note that this first panel is not a panel of property tax experts. We'll have more of those in our second panel. They obviously don't speak also for all people in Multnomah County or in Black communities or communities of color. They are here as experts in their own lives to share their own lived experience and to add their stories to the maps and the data you saw last week. And we are really, really appreciative of their willingness to do that. We will have some time at the end of the segment for comments and questions, so we just ask that you hold your comments and questions until then. And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Estelle Norris. Take it away, Estelle.
Thank you, Commissioner Jayapal. Again, my name is Estelle Norris, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm excited and honored to be part of this conversation. I hope that you all had an opportunity to read my short bio, but I just wanted to call out again that I am currently working as an employee engagement and inclusion analyst with Multnomah County's Department of County Management, or DCM. And I've worked in the Division of Assessment, Recording, and Taxation, known as DART, and also Central Human Resources for a total of 14 years now. Leading with race and incorporating equity in our practices is not just a Multnomah County value, but it is a way of life for me. I try to bring that lens to all that I do. I am constantly asking who will be most impacted and who will benefit most from change, or in this case, reform. That's why I'm happy to be participating here today. What I am going to share with you is just a little of my story from my time living in Portland. As a homeowner and taxpayer in Multnomah County, I currently reside in the city of Gresham, but I still feel very connected to my Portland roots. I attended Jefferson High School in the mid-1990s when Portland was still a mecca for Black people. There were Black-owned hair salons, barbershops, and beauty supply stores that I frequented, like Geneva's, Waves, and Mrs. C's. These were landmarks for us. Up and down the Northeast Portland streets were Black families owning and renting homes. There was a Black church on almost every corner in Northeast Portland, it seemed, and a lot of them were affiliated with the Church of God in Christ, which is the organization I have belonged to since I was a little girl. I've seen Northeast street corners filled with prostitution and drugs in the 80s, and then gangs and drive-bys in the 90s. At that time, there were a lot of folks who were scared to even walk down the streets over there, and especially after dark. But I still loved my town, and I always felt like I belonged. Over the years, I have watched gentrification sweep through the streets of Portland and push people further and further out to the numbers, as we referred to it back then, and often felt like the only thing that remained of us was the Black church. As I became an adult and a mom for the first time, I found myself in Clackamas County, living just off McLaughlin Boulevard in a Section 8 approved home to give my daughter and I our start in life together. I began working at Multnomah County as an office assistant in DART, and eventually was able to get off Section 8 and become self-sufficient. A few years later, I got married and we began expanding our family. We soon started to outgrow our 2-bedroom rental, so my husband, a Portland native, and myself began looking for a home to buy. We did not have a down payment or much money saved up, so finding a home we could afford proved to be challenging. At the time, we only qualified for about $150,000, and those were mostly fixers around Milwaukee and Portland. We decided to wait a bit and get our finances together. We waited about a year and tried looking again. At that time, they told us we could afford about $200,000, and we were excited because we just knew that now we could get the house we needed. We quickly realized that housing prices had increased dramatically, and now the home we needed was looking more like $225,000. We waited a little more and kept looking on and off. Each time we looked, the houses were more and more expensive, and they just never seemed to be within reach. On August 8th, 2012, there was a major fire in the fourplex we were renting, and we were suddenly without a home. My elderly mother-in-law took us in, thankfully. She was still living in the home she purchased with her husband for their family in 1950. A cute house on the corner of Northeast 11th and Mason, the house my husband and his siblings had grown up in. It was not ideal conditions cramming all of us into that house, but it did come with the perks of being in Northeast Portland. We were closer to church, literally less than 5 minutes away. Our children were able to attend Sabin School, which at the time was a K-8, so my oldest daughter was able to walk my little daughter to school each day. They enjoyed stopping off at Starbucks on 15th and Fremont on their way home from school some days. They had a great mix of friends from different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds. We had not planned to stay with my mother-in-law as long as we did, but she needed care, and we ended up staying with her for 4 years until she passed away in 2016. Throughout that time, we looked for a home to buy again. I wanted to live where my mother-in-law was, but that was just not going to be an option for us. We couldn't afford to buy her house once she passed away either, because we couldn't afford to buy out my husband's siblings by purchasing the house at market value and then having to spend an additional $200,000, according to our realtor, just to fix it up and make it more habitable. Other homes in that area at the time were well over $500,000, and that simply was out of our price range. We quickly had to face reality that we were priced out of Portland, Milwaukee, Clackamas, and Happy Valley. Our only option that we knew of was Gresham, the last affordable city. It was a harsh reality for my husband, who had grown up in Northeast Portland and even owned a home in the area just a few years before we got married. The market had changed that rapidly. My husband is older than me, and he told me stories of how he was bused to David Douglas School District in the 70s to help integrate the schools, and also how my mother-in-law in 1950 would have found it very difficult at best if she wanted to move to Gresham due to redlining or other discriminatory practices. And here I was saying that was our only option now. He was not happy, and I just wanted a home. After about 6 months of searching, probably 12 offers placed and outbid by cash offers for way more than the homes were worth, I found a wonderful turnkey home in Gresham, just past Southeast 181st and Powell, that had only one owner. It was a very well taken care of home and had a backyard that looked like a park, something you don't necessarily find in Northeast Portland. We jumped on it. We purchased it for just over $300,000, and our taxes on average are around $3,500 a year. Our realtor was simultaneously helping us close on our house and putting my mother-in-law's house on the market. We sold my mother-in-law's home as a cash fixer to a developer for close to $450,000, and the taxes on average were $1,500 a year. That house is now worth almost $700,000, and the taxes are only around $2,500 a year, a stark contrast to our experience in Gresham. Since moving to Gresham, we have continued to bus our children, if you will, to Northeast Portland so they can remain at school with their friends. We also wanted them to continue having a sense of community and affinity to the neighborhood and the people they had been with. We want them to feel connected to our roots and our history as well. An added bonus is they continue benefiting from services such as Self-Enhancement, Inc., and they have opportunities to participate in the United Negro College Fund's Portfolio Project and the Nike Product Creation Experience, which offer monetary awards and scholarships for participation. These programs are typically geared towards communities of color, kids of color who are in danger and need support. Programs like Self-Enhancement, Inc. have had to expand their reach in order to continue providing services to the population they were designed to help. As Northeast Portland changed and more folks of color moved further east, SEI, or Self-Enhancement, Inc., has expanded from just Portland Public Schools to include Park Rose and Reynolds school districts as well. I can only imagine the financial pressure this puts on a nonprofit organization who now has to account for additional staff and new transportation costs. The story that I have shared with you is tangled up in racial inequities that are tied to wealth gaps, access to home ownership, knowledge of the tax system and tax laws, proximity to historically Black communities, and services often accessed by those communities. Over the years, these discriminatory practices intentionally left BIPOC residents out of processes and conversations. I want to close by saying thank you, Commissioner Jayapal, for your heart and concern and for beginning this conversation. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of those participating in this conversation and for not pushing through a rushed idea, but for being careful and intentional about how to improve our tax system in Oregon. And most importantly, thank you for including the voices of those who live and experience the impact of laws like these firsthand. More of that will need to continue as you all move closer to figuring out the how of this puzzle. But I do thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for that, Estelle. Thank you for sharing your story. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Allison Spencer. Go ahead, Allison. Allison, you're still on mute. There you go.
All right. Thank you for having me this morning. Legislators, the chair, and commissioners. I am very happy to be able to tell my story. First, owning a home is a very important part of the American dream. We envision a home with space to live, grow, refresh, and heal, a place to share and make memories with family and friends, a home that is within our budget and close to needed services and amenities. Many of us hope to live around people who look like us and share our cultural heritage. Also, we'd be happy to live in diverse communities where people reflect and respect the positive aspects of one another, a beloved community. Also, home ownership is the primary source of wealth creation that most Americans have. As we consider needed tax reform, I fear the real possibility that attaining and retaining home ownership will be taken away from many low and moderate income residents in general, and from members of culturally significant communities in particular. Cultural specific communities are communities of people who historically, racially, or culturally are distinct from Oregon's white majority. These culturally significant communities must be recognized, honored, and sustained if we are to have diverse neighborhoods with economic and social opportunity for all. I fear the raising of all property, the taxes on all property owners in order to bring their areas into tax parity will especially cause racial minorities living in those areas to suffer irreparable damage to their ability to stay in their homes and businesses. An example of a culturally specific community who would suffer this fate are African Americans, low to moderate income homeowners who reside in inner Northeast Portland, which is one of the areas being targeted for property tax increase. I would like to share my personal history and insights as an African American who was born and raised in Northeast Portland and who later in life brought this home, this 112-year-old home now, beautiful, and who helped this to shape housing policy in this area. My grandparents moved to Portland in 1915 and raised my mother and her five siblings in a home on 7th and Shaver Streets. After my parents married, me and my 8 brothers and sisters grew up in 2 houses here in Northeast Portland, one on 10th and Knott, and the other on 23rd and Morgan. And we lived here during the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. For both generations, Northeast Portland was a wonderful place to grow up. Now, fast forward to 2003, I bought this home and moved back into the neighborhood on Simpson Street, which is right across the street from Safeway store off of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. This was shortly before the wave of gentrified housing prices washed over the area. When I moved here, my block held a small furniture store, which was on the corner of MLK, an abandoned house, an empty lot, and then there was my house and a little house on the corner that was built in the 1800s. Now, it begins with a convenience store on MLK, then a small urban clothing store, then 2 recently small apartment buildings with 12 to 16 units respectively. And there's my house, and the little house on the corner has turned into a rental unit. The hard reality is that for many of us, is that unless you live in subsidized housing or bought your home before the wave of gentrification or have a financial nest egg, you can't afford to live in my neighborhood. Today, the studio apartment next door, where my friend Dee lives, she's a recent transplant from Walnut County, California, cost almost the same amount of rent as my monthly mortgage. This is a studio. And the face of my neighborhood has changed too, right before my eyes. The majority Black and brown faces living here when I moved in have been replaced by the majority of young white faces. The culture of the neighborhood has changed. Dogs replace kids, heads looking down at iPhones instead of looking up at you and saying hi. You have bike riders and joggers, pubs and galleries and food carts. And you have generational and cultural divide. Now I sit on my front porch and see the people coming in and out of Safeway. I hear soul music coming from the cars that come in and out of the parking lot. And those diverse faces, many of whom are African American, that shop at Safeway store, and the 4 other African American homeowners that live on Simpson Street between 6th and 9th are my only touchstone to the Northeast Portland I grew up in. How did it happen? Policies and resource allocations made by agencies like the Portland Development Commission over the years are a major reason why. The city used poverty-laden census tracts of inner Northeast Portland, the historic home of Oregon's African American residents, to justify the infusions of hundreds of millions of federal and local community development and urban renewal dollars to the area over the past 50 years. Through their planning processes and agreements, African Americans were given a promissory note which says our neighborhoods and communities would be made better for us. Quality, affordable home ownership, rental housing, and business spaces would be possible for us. Our businesses and institutions would be enabled and supported. And implementation of these projects would lead to jobs for us. I personally helped shape the urban renewal housing policy during my 6-year tenure at the Portland Development Commission. In the interstate urban renewal housing implementation strategy, a process I facilitated and documented, the city committed to mitigating displacement and assuring African Americans and other existing residents that we would benefit from the community development that urban renewal would bring. These promises included decreasing the threat of voluntary displacement from the area due to market pressures and public actions, and leveraging urban renewal funds to the fullest with other public and private resources to ensure housing preservation and development goals are achieved and concerns related to involuntary displacement of existing residents are effectively addressed. And for the hundreds of hours of input into those planning processes, African Americans had, that promissory note was returned stamped insufficient funds. Disingenuous implementation of public policy and investment enabled market-driven development over implementing the community benefits that were promised. I left PDC after making too much good trouble due to my persistent questioning of the organization's commitment to holding to its promises to the community. That questioning resulted in me receiving a performance evaluation stating I was not a team player. I saw the writing on the wall and left to work at PCRI and eventually Multnomah County, where I ended my career. I'm here enjoying my retirement, and you can believe my house note is the first thing I pay each month. So now refocusing on property tax reform, I would like to summarize and conclude. As a result of a string of broken promises to the African American community, starting from the Model Cities program through urban renewal and the present, there are relatively few African Americans who own a home in this area. Just to be clear, I'm referring to the descendants of African Americans who were brought to this country starting in 1619 and upon whose back much of America's prosperity was founded and nurtured. Those African Americans who came to Portland to build ships for the war effort and who after the war were redlined into renting and purchasing homes in Northeast Portland. I'm talking about the sprinkling of African Americans like me and their families. Many of us are seniors living on fixed incomes, determined by our work and life chances. These incomes were determined by our work and life chances. And like other seniors in the area, we face the rising cost of living and growing old. And we hold on to the dream that we can stay in our home open it up to family and friends, and that we'll be able to pass it on to our children and grandchildren when we go, so that they too can share in another American dream, which is intergenerational wealth. We must build in concrete policies and strategies to make sure this happens. African Americans who are low and moderate income property owners and people from other culturally significant communities around the state deserve a permanent moratorium on hikes in their property taxes due to tax reform. This is the only way we can continue to live in our houses, carry on our cultural traditions, and contribute to the positive evolution of our neighborhoods that have gentrified around us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your story and your perspectives, and for continuing to make good trouble. And now I turn it over to Michelle Ruffin.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I guess I just want to start by just, it's a tough act to follow. I think listening to both Allison and Estelle's story is exactly where as you all as decision makers and lawmakers and folks who are really thinking about long-term solutions, those very stories have embedded all of the solutions needed to actually move what we want long-term. So I just really, really appreciate that. And I'm sad I'm following because it's a tough act to follow. But I appreciate Commissioner Jayapal for inviting me to join us. My name's Michelle Ruffin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the political director with Forward Together and Forward Together Action. And how I describe our work is that we work with women of color and trans and gender nonconforming folks of color, mostly in North and Northeast Portland, but we have supporters statewide. And we are a multi-issue, multiracial organization. So we talk about all sorts of issues ranging from reproductive justice all the way, to things like budget and tax policy. And I think we really come from the worldview that all of the issues we discuss are really important. So again, I just want to thank Commissioner Jayapal for allowing us to be here and share a little bit of what our organizing has looked like to this point. So I'm going to zero in a little bit more on, I'm going to give you a little preview of some of the budget and revenue training that we actually do share with our constituents. We've, since January, before the pandemic, we actually have been working to train folks both in person and now virtually on the overall Oregon budget and revenue system. And we talk about it through a context of what our history has looked like around racial injustice. So I also just want to give a shout out to the amazing Walida Marisha, who has done some incredible contexting around the history of our statehood. And some of her work is actually part of the context that we give people. So since January, we've actually trained over 185 folks, both in person and over Zoom. And we talk a little bit about what the budget process is. So I'll ask Angela Donnelly's help in sharing a couple screens for us so you could just see some things visually. We can move on from, perfect. Thanks, Angela. So that first slide, or that second slide that we just saw, is, if you can go back, Angela, it's a picture of our January training before we sort of hit the pandemic that we're in, where we talked about the Oregon budget. And what we heard from folks, I think the main thing we heard was like, there's appetite for this. There's appetite to learn more about the system wholesale and not just focus in on one specific fund or one specific service, but that we really need to share some context historically about what has built what we see today. So these are just some pictures of folks who joined us in January. And some of the snippets, and we can move on to the next slide. Some of the things that we talk about in the training is actual context that you'll see in these slides for, although they don't necessarily say property tax, there's certainly a context that moved us into this place, right? So we talk about the Oregon Donation Land Law of 1850 and how the specific exclusion of Black African American folks, Chinese folks, Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous people, specifically without white fathers from owning land. There was 320 acres of land that was granted by Congress for folks to own, and none of that, it was explicitly excluded folks of color in the state. We talk about, we can move to the next slide, we talk about Oregon statehood and how 1857, more than 50,000 people called Oregon home. But by 1859, we talk about the very explicit exclusion of Black people from the state. Can move on. And then, and of course, these are just some snippets, but I think to some of what Allison and Estelle were sharing, that there are specific projects, that, just like the 1956 Wright Memorial Coliseum in the Elliott neighborhood project, that displaced homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So we just share with folks that sort of historical context, that although we have a system that is built and very upside down of, when you look at a chart of how revenue comes into the state, it feels so disproportionately burdened on lower middle class folks and communities of color because of the specific exclusions history we have. So we can move on one more. So this is the sort of summary that we use. And I think these are three big things that are just important to share if you get anything from us. That, you know, as much as we hear all kinds of analysis about both property tax, but in general, tax policy in Oregon, I think the thing that often comes off to, that we hear all the time from folks, supporters, is that it feels so race neutral. It feels like there is not a way in which we can talk about any of this without the context of history. And it's really been baked into tax policy since Oregon's beginning. So on the left, you can actually see language from the 1862 Oregon poll tax. And that they've been built over time to reinforce white supremacy, and that the tax policies mainly benefit white Oregonians, even when race isn't mentioned. So, so I will have us skip a few because I feel like you all have talked a little bit about sources of money. You've talked a little bit about revenue in Oregon. So I want to move us to just what we found, right? And we talked to folks about the measures, which I know you all have gone over in previous session. Let's talk about some of the things that we learned in our organizing. So Angela, you can take it to one more slide, and I think that's the last one. We did a train for trainers with organizers in the social justice movement in January, and we did one again virtually recently. And we've done 3 with supporters and volunteers over the last 7 months. And we just found the difference of folks stepping into the space from them stepping out. So if you can see, right, with our supporters and volunteers, we have folks, almost 10% of folks who came in to those spaces were like, I know a little bit, I feel like I know some, but I'd like to learn, or I have this story about how I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years and seen my neighbors change. But how does that connect to Oregon's history of budget and revenue, and how does it connect to property tax? So we just talk about how, like, this is a huge difference, right? 9 to 62% of folks feeling like they walked back out of the training feeling like they learned a lot. And I guess I'll especially note that the appetite was there. 94% of participants right afterwards took action and were ready to write local and state leaders about very specific solutions that we can get to. So, and it's notable, I put the organizers in here for the train the trainers too, because it felt like, okay, well, maybe us organizers know a little bit more, and to see that difference as well, that like many of us have pieces of knowledge, but don't entirely know the whole the whole of the story, it actually gave us a lot of confidence, understanding that folks walked in with less knowledge and walked out with more, and felt like it was useful. So I'll pause there. You've heard stories. I think the takeaway for me is that in organizing, I know it feels specifically, it feels like not as, it doesn't hit you quite as a human if you're talking about other social justice issues, but I actually think that property tax has woven inside of it, as both Estelle and Allison have shared, such humanistic stories about real impact, and how important it is that if we're interested in real solutions, that we hear from real people, and that we really try to aim to make a system that is not built on the history our current one is. So, pause there.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for connecting those dots. And also, you know, I think the other thing that, especially that last slide points out, one of the places that we've historically gotten stuck in terms of addressing this particular issue is the fact that it takes a constitutional amendment. And I think, you know, that last slide points us towards the fact that that there might be a path here to actually building the support by building understanding about all of those stories and the way that those dots are connected. So really appreciate that. So we have some time now for questions and comments, if anyone has some for the panelists.
You can just hop on if you want, or if you want to use the raise your hand function, is probably a little easier than doing it through the chat. But thank you everybody for your nice comments, particularly presenters. I hope you're seeing some of the great feedback that you're getting in the chat as well. Go ahead, Alex.
I just really want to say thank you to the presenters. My daughter lives in Northeast Portland now, and I've been texting with her just to share some of these stories. But I also want to say, you know, downstate, and we're not that far downstate, but we are, and our situation is, with respect to property tax, is so tied to federal forest revenues. It's a really different scenario, but we're also motivated, obviously, by being here to join with you folks and talk about what possibilities are. So while our situations are different, sort of, I guess I just felt compelled to say thank you so much for sharing those experiences with us. And you know, this will take a statewide effort, and believe me, across my career, I've been looking for how do we really get a coalition built to talk about property tax reform, because it really is necessary, I think, in Oregon. And so I just wanted to say thank you again for creating this forum, and anything we can do down here to help push this along, we're willing.
Thank you, Alex. Any other questions or comments for this panel? And if not, again, thank you all so much, you know, for sort of adding that human dimension to the information that we had last week, for bringing your perspectives, for making good trouble, all of you. And I think the other thing that each of you has pointed out is that this is complicated, but what each of you is also saying to us is that it is our job as policymakers to figure out complicated. That's what we're here to do. So again, thank you so much. And please do stay for the rest of it if you'd like to, or not, if you want to get back to your grandkids, Allison. that sounds like fun. So thanks again. With that, we're going to move to our next panel, and here we go back to the wonkiness of the property tax system. And Alex, I think maybe address some of the things that you pointed out, which is that it looks different in different parts of the state and in different counties. So our first speaker here is Jason Bettles.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Bettles.
Jason, your audio, Jason, I'm going to interrupt for a second because your audio is it's a little hard to hear.
Okay.
There we go. That's better.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
It's still a little hard to hear, but it sounds like it might be a directional thing, Jason. So if you're using your computer audio, if you know kind of where it comes in, you might want to lean a little closer to your computer and stay directed toward it. That often helps.
Okay.
Or if you have earphones that you know are good with a good mic, you could try plugging them in too.
Yeah. Let me see if I can get this fixed. Is that better? Worse? Same? Better? Worse? Same?
I think that's actually a little worse.
Okay.
Yet somehow every time you say okay, it sounds better. So I think it might be the leaning, actually.
Well, then everything is okay. Okay. Is that better or worse? For you guys?
That is about the same.
How about this? Better or worse? Same?
I feel like I'm at the eye doctor. That's about the same.
Okay. Okay. And you said this one's a little bit worse? Can you hear me now? I feel like I'm in a variety commercial.
Maybe try leaning in as majority leader suggested.
Okay. Okay. I'm leaning in a little bit right now.
That's better.
And also though, Jason, this is going to sound a little strange. Like when you turned to your left and leaned forward, that was actually when the sound has been the best so far.
Okay.
So turn left.
Turn left. All right. Okay. Is that working?
That's about the best it's been.
Okay. It's really strange. I apologize for this, everyone. I've been using this setup with my staff for weeks, and I haven't had this kind of an issue before. So I'll do the best I can, and I'll speak up a little bit louder than I normally do. So I hope that helps. But let me go ahead and get started because I know we have a limited amount of time here. But my name is Jason Bettles, and I'm an appraisal supervisor from Multnomah County. I supervise industrial and commercial property valuations. I am a descendant of the Klamath and Warm Springs tribes, and also a member of the Confederacy tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and also the Chugach Alaska Native Corporation. And I've been working in the property tax assessment line of work for about 15 years now. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you all and to present the few points that I have to this panel. So I thank you for the time, and I hope that you'll be able to get something from it. So if we can move on to the next slide, I wanted to go over three points with you guys, and each of these points can be expanded to much longer conversations, but I want to try to hit on some of the highlights as quickly as I can. First, I want to go over a little bit of the operational realities of administering the property tax assessments under the Measure 50 system, and then I'd like to talk about a slightly different idea of how property tax can be administered under something more like a levy-based system. And our Multnomah County auditor has commissioned a study in the past year that really highlights the difference of how property tax is distributed between residential and commercial properties. And then third, I wanted to briefly go over and reinforce some of the talking points that have been presented up to this point so far, and how these tax effects have affected BIPOC communities in Portland and in Multnomah County. So can you go on to the next slide? So if you look at this first slide, I picked a random residential property in Northeast Portland and pulled up their property tax graph from our Multnomah County website. And what you can see is the differential between the real market value, the maximum assessed value, and the assessed value. The green line is the total real market value that we've assessed at. That's the value that the property should sell for if it were to transact in the market. And the bottom line is that dashed line, the blue and pink, is actually two lines that are overlaying each other. They are the maximum assessed value and the assessed value. So in 2019, you can see that this property had a market value of about $540,000, but was really only assessed at $160,000. And this is due to a number of factors, but you can see the vast disparity, the difference between how a property can be expected to sell, what its worth is, and what it's actually taxed on. And so what we need to look at here is that the appraisers, we have to maintain an accurate real market value on the properties. That's our job. But the assessed value is the value that really is driving the revenue for the tax districts. And you can see there can be quite a bit of difference between those two values. Can we move on to the next slide? Now here I wanted to highlight a case where the assessed value can increase by more than the 3% rule that most people often quote, and sometimes they quote it incorrectly. But here we have an example of an industrial property where the assessed value increased at more than 3% in 2018 and 2019. And this is due to an addition that was added to the property. So the addition, the physical change of a property and the addition of more square footage is what we would call an exception event. And that allows us to increase the assessable value of the property by more than the 3%. So it's considered an exception to the 3% rule. So here is, so you can see that we are really trying to look for exception events in the marketplace in order to increase the assessed values of the properties. But still, in this circumstance, you can see that the assessed value of the property is still less than the real market value of the property. And can we go on to the next slide? So the way we find exception events in the marketplace is we have to look for permits that are issued by the cities and the local jurisdictions. And the permits can sometimes not be very easy to come by. And you can see there's a small stack of paper there. I can tell you from my own experience working in the assessment business, especially in my earlier years, my stacks of papers of permits that I had to go through are a lot larger than that. So in Multnomah County, it receives thousands of permits each year that we have to follow up on. And we've converted to an electronic method of receiving the permits from the jurisdictions, but it's still complicated. There's still coding issues. There are still things that we still have to figure out how to get the permits to the appraisers and how to screen them and narrow down the permits to find just the permits that are actually going to result in a tangible increase in the assessed value of the property. Not all permits warrant adjustment to the maximum assessed value. It's up to the appraiser to apply the correct judgment, and that takes time. Can you move on to the next slide? So what this means is that the assessors, we have to chase permits in order to chase exception and to have an impact on the maximum assessed value and assessed value that comprise taxable property value. So what this means is that a lot of effort is spent trying to have an impact on that assessed value of a property rather than maintaining the real market value of the property. And there are some aspects of property ownership that are not reflected in the taxable value of the property, such as the increased desirability of the neighborhood or an increase in the marketing conditions for our property. So what we're doing is we're really not able to assess properties at their full value. And can you move on to the next slide? So that kind of made me want to talk about a different idea of how to look at property tax assessments. In 2014, our Multnomah County Auditor commissioned a study that looked into the inequities of property tax in Multnomah County. And he came up with an idea called a revenue neutral tax model. And this used the 2013 tax revenue, and he redistributed the property tax levy across all property types based on their real market value, not on the assessed value, or not on the maximum assessed value, but on the real market value. And what he found overall is that residential properties would actually experience a decrease in their property tax liability, whereas commercial properties and multifamily properties would have to pay a little bit more. Can you move on to the next slide? So just to reinforce the definition of a revenue neutral tax model, we're assuming that the total tax revenue in a study period either increases or decreases, and we use 2013 tax revenue as the baseline. And the property tax liability is spread evenly across all property types based on RMV, and the MAV and the AV do not exist under this scenario. So we're really looking at kind of an alternate reality, a test scenario to see how property taxes can be more fairly distributed among all property types, not just residential, but residential, commercial, industrial, and multifamily.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Lori Monis-Anderson on your previous slide. Can you go back to that one? So just explain the coloring a little bit.
Okay, so when you look at this, the red coloring and the green coloring indicate the amount of approximate property tax change. So if property tax were distributed evenly among all property types based on the real market values, rather than these MAVs or AVs that we have in our current property tax system, the red areas would experience an increase in property values, whereas the green areas of the map would experience a decrease in property tax.
So what does that mean to the amount an individual would pay? I mean, it seems like it's all red. So much is now red. So does that mean that the property taxes are going to be increasing more than 15%?
That's the map for commercial properties.
Oh, commercial properties.
Yes, and the map on top, which is mostly green.
Oh,
those are the residential properties.
Now I understand. Thank you. All right.
Yes, yes. So most residential properties would actually experience a relative decrease in their property tax liability, whereas commercial and multifamily properties would experience an increase in property tax liabilities if the property tax levy were spread evenly among all properties according to their real market values, not on these MAVs or AVs, which are constructs of the Measure 50 system that we're currently living under. So in this slide, we have 4 pictures of some bar graphs that show a residential, industrial, commercial, and multifamily properties. And you can see in the green bars, those show the relative decrease of more than 15% or a decrease from 5 to 15% in property tax bills, or a plus or minus 5% change. And the red bars indicate an increase of 5 to 15% in property tax, or an increase of more than 50% in property tax. So you can see that there would be an overall reduction in tax liabilities for residential and industrial properties, and an overall increase in tax liability for commercial and multifamily properties. And that's a fair distribution among all property types: commercial, multifamily, residential, industrial. And I wanted to bring this into the conversation so that we're talking about more than just residential properties, but we're talking about all properties that are going to be affected by our property tax laws. Can we move on to the next slide? So also, if property taxes were based on real market value, the residential property tax liabilities okay, this might be a repeat of the last slide, but again, you can see that there would be a net increase in tax liability for commercial properties.
Jason, I can't hear you. Can you try better?
Yeah, you can see that there would be an overall increase in property tax liability for commercial properties and an overall decrease in tax liability for residential properties. And can you advance to the next slide?
Okay, then this is Lori Monis Anderson again. So on the multifamily properties, those are big apartments. I mean, that has to be paid, passed on to the renters. So it would be nice to know what percentage increase on rent that would be too. So we have to think about that too. Thanks.
Okay. Now, this next slide that I wanted to show you would be if property taxes were based on real market value. What was found was that property owners in low-income neighborhoods would generally gain a significantly more property tax relief than those in high-income neighborhoods. And this study is available on our county website, and so these maps are actually interactive. You can click on these zip codes, and you can see a corresponding change in the bar charts to see how much of a property tax change there would be for those zip codes based on the median household income. But overall, what was found was that in the 5 zip codes with the lowest income, property taxes would decrease for 93% of residential properties. But also, in the 5 zip codes with the highest income, property taxes would decrease for 73% of residential properties. So there's still an overall net increase in property tax liability for homeowners. Okay, next slide, please. And the last thing is I wanted to reinforce what kind of impact this may have had on BIPOC communities in Multnomah County. And this chart shows the average price appreciation per house between 1990 and 2015. And you can see that in the core areas of Multnomah County, the areas shaded in pink are the houses that experienced a median amount of $200,000 price appreciation. And many of these areas are also in the areas that have now experienced lower property tax bills in relation to their real market value. So you can see this is an area of the city of Portland that experiences wealth appreciation. And if you advance to the next slide, you can see that in 1990, this was the concentration of the Black population that existed in North Portland. And you can see that it was highly concentrated in those north and northeast areas. And you can move on to the next slide. When we fast forward to 2017, we can see that the Black population has been dispersed.
You need to speak up, Jason. You're really fading out.
I apologize for that. In this slide, you can see that the Black community has been dispersed throughout the city of Portland and away from those inner north and northeast areas of the city. Did that help?
Yeah, that helped some, and now you're fading again.
Okay. All right. So if we back up a little bit. So you can see that the Black community here was historically located in those inner north and northeast sections of the city. And by being dispersed out to the outer areas of the city, now they're in the neighborhoods and the parts of the county that have a higher percentage of property tax in relation to the real market value than in the historic neighborhoods that they were originally living in. So that's kind of probably an unintended effect of the property tax system that we have and its effect on the Black communities and other communities of color that are being priced out of the north northeast Portland areas. So I guess with that, I'll turn this over to Mark, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jason. Go ahead, Mark.
So my name is Mark Arst. I'm the lobbyist for tax, finance, and economic development with the League of Oregon Cities. First, I just have to say a big thank you to Commissioner Jayapal for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to share a little bit about Measure 5 and Measure 50 implications around the state. This is a huge issue for the League of Oregon Cities. the league has been at the forefront of working on property tax reform for a number of years. My predecessor, Wendy Johnson, worked quite a bit with Senator Haas when he was taking a look at this. And prior to that, Chris Fick, who's now with Multnomah County in Commissioner Vega Peterson's office, had my position, and he took a huge run at this. So I think that Chris may have told me one time that he pushed the rock up the hill, and it was Wendy's turn to push the rock up the hill. And I think that now it's my turn to, and I really hope that we can push this rock over the hill this time. The property tax system generates about $7.5 billion a year, and about 20% of this goes to the cities. And so this is our #1 source of revenue, and it's obviously something that we watch very closely. Like Commissioner Jayapal, the league does not have a firm position right now on what property tax reform should look like. We're staying very open, but we do have some principles. We would like to see any changes to the property tax system enhance local choice, give voters the ability to levy a tax upon themselves to provide services that they want. We would like to see the system achieve equity and fairness. We would like similarly situated taxpayers to be treated similarly. And we would like for folks who have less ability to pay, particularly folks on a fixed income, to be able to get some relief from property taxes. Finally, we're interested in adequacy. We want the property tax system to fund the services that Oregonians demand. So moving on to the first slide. We've talked quite a bit about horizontal inequity, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows this is not just a Portland problem. Here you have a somewhat dated example of 2 houses in Salem that sold. They sold for the same value, and the property tax difference is very significant compared to the total amount. This can happen for a number of reasons. In Portland, a lot of it is driven by appreciation, but in other places around the state, there can be other considerations that lead to people having radically different bills. I think Jason touched on one of them pretty well, and that is that exception events like new construction and remodeling don't always get captured. And so if one person hires a contractor to do their work and that contractor pulls permits, it's more likely to be picked up. But if another homeowner does it himself and maybe or herself and maybe doesn't actually pull the right permits, then the chances of the assessor catching it are pretty slim. If we could go to the next slide. Another reason that folks might see radically different bills, it really depends on timing. So here we have 2 townhouses in Bend, same development, same street, same block, and they have radically different tax bills. What's the difference here? Well, it's the build date. If you look, the first unit was built in 2006, and you think about what the market looked like in Bend in 2006, real estate values were going through the roof. The gap between the real market value and the assessed value was getting larger countywide. And so when the assessor put this property on the roll, the change property ratio was low. That ratio is the average of all the properties of that class in that area. And so here, the total average was a low number, and that got applied to the new improvements. Then you go to 2010 when the second home is built. That home was in a time when real estate values had tanked. We had seen like a 30% decline in real estate values statewide. And that increase, that had the effect of increasing the change property ratio, which got applied to these new improvements. And the result is that the tax difference is 76% higher for the second home that was built during a recession. Now, the market in Bend has returned pretty much to where it was at the high, but the lingering effects of Measure 50 are still there. That second homeowner is paying a significantly higher value. So this is not just a problem with older neighborhoods. This is a problem statewide, and it really has to do with often with timing as much as anything. We could go to the next slide. I also want to say this is not just an issue with residential property. I think that, we think about voters, and so, a lot of this has focused on residential properties, but we see the same effects in commercial properties. So unfortunately, this example is from Multnomah County, but this is just some great data, and I couldn't just leave it behind. So this is some work that my predecessor did. We looked at 100+ gas stations working with the folks at Multnomah County Assessor's Office. And we found just numerous examples where one gas station, same real market value, radically different tax bill. And if you could go to the next slide. Here's kind of a heat map. And you can kind of see that it's not just one example. This is all over the county. And each of these dots represents a gas station. And the bigger dots are folks who are losers in this system, right? They're paying on a higher taxable value relative to their real market value. And the smaller dots are the winners. Those are people who are paying on a lower assessed value relative to their real market value. So, you know, as we move to through this process of trying to get property tax reform, we're going to need support of the business community. And I think that it's important to show them that, you know, this is not just an issue that affects residential property owners. If businesses want to be competitive with each other, they should have a similar burden as far as taxes go. And I think that this is a really significant issue that often gets overlooked. So if we could go on to the next slide. So that was talking about the one effect of Measure 50, right? Which is the limitations that we have on that taxable value, right? The assessed value, which is the lesser of the real market value or the maximum assessed value. Measure 50 also put limitations on permanent rates. And I think that when Alex commented earlier, he was kind of getting at this a little bit. So when we moved to Measure 50, we moved from what was mostly a levy-based system to a rate-based system. And Dr. Warner talked about this on his first slide when he started off his presentation last Wednesday. These permanent rates, basically what they did is they tried to take what the districts were levying at that time, and then they tried to back into a property tax rate that would put them at 70% reduction in the levy based off of 90% of the 1995-96 real market value. If this sounds terribly complicated, it is. This calculation was actually called the black box calculation because nobody actually knew what was going on. And so there is a book at the Department of Revenue with Caterpillar paper, you know, the paper with the holes on the side, with just pages and pages of code where they tried to figure out these permanent rates. But they basically came up with a number that each district would be able to levy. And that number is permanent. So if we could go on to the next slide. Here are some examples of cities. These have populations. These population numbers are a little dated, but 25 to 40,000. And you can see that, you know, cities that you expect might have similar rates don't. They have radically different rates. Often these cities, you know, are expected to provide the same services as the city next door, but they might have a lot less money with which to provide those services. How do they make up the difference? Often it's fees. And fees are often regressive. You know, a fee will be a set amount. It's not based off of income. And as Dr. Warner explained, property taxes kind of are at least tied to income because they're tied to the value of the asset. And you generally think that someone, you know, who has more means is going to have a more valuable asset. So, so we often are pushing people into fees, the cities, and as a result, it often ends up being more regressive. If we could go to the next slide. Here's just kind of a breakdown of different permanent rates for the cities in Oregon and kind of where they, you know, fall in different ranges. You know, you can see that there are a significant number of outliers on the high end and the low end. And there are a lot of folks who are in the $1 to $5 range, and that's a gigantic range. So again, this is a legacy of Measure 50. It puts people at a disadvantage in cities that have a lower permanent rate if you assume that the folks want to pay for their services. You could argue that it maybe puts them at an advantage because they pay less in taxes, but it's how you look at it. So if we could go on to the next slide. Not just an issue for cities, right? The permanent rates got applied to all the districts. And so here you see the permanent rates of the various school districts. I'm sorry, this thing is a bit of a mess. There are a lot of school districts. But the point is that, you know, the rates vary. And so the folks on the far right of this graph are the districts that have rates that are lower than the folks on the left. And you see that there are a pretty good number of them. We have 39 districts, school districts that have a rate, permanent rate less than $4. We have 18 districts that have a permanent rate less than $3. Now, the school funding formula comes in and backfills, right, to get to a per student amount for each student with general funds. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that folks that are in these districts with really low permanent rates are getting more of a backfill from the general fund, and arguably they're being subsidized by the people on the left end of the graph. Now, a lot of these districts are in parts of the state that are not doing as well financially. A lot of them are in Eastern Oregon, but not all of them. One of the districts that has a rate of $3.81 is the Riverdale district, which is an area of Portland just north of Lake Oswego, really one of the most, you know, Tony districts in Portland, and they have a lower permanent rate, probably because they have a higher tax base, right? Those houses are more expensive. But if you talk about progressive and regressive, the notion that they pay at a lower rate compared to people in other parts of the state is a little, it doesn't feel right necessarily. So, so again, permanent rates. Next slide, please, is counties. So here's a few select counties, and we can just skip to the next slide. And here are all the counties, okay? And so you see, and I'm sorry if this is a little hard to read, but you see that these rates, you know, go from as low as 58 cents up to $8.70 per $1,000 of assessed value for permanent rates. Now, why is there so much variation? Well, as Alex alluded to, a lot of the counties, right, that have these lower rates, particularly these rates less than $2 per thousand, were counties that were receiving a significant amount of money from timber at the time that these permanent rates were set. We had the spotted owl war, we've had other environmental regulations. That timber money has dried up for a lot of folks, and the permanent rate is still there. So these counties are really struggling to make ends meet, and a big part of it is because these permanent rates are permanent. We had a legislator who will not be named at his request, who was from Southern Oregon and brought a concept that maybe we should force everybody up to a $2 permanent rate. But the reason he wanted to bring it forward was because he knew that he couldn't get his voters to approve local option levies. And so you have a lot of voters who don't want to increase their taxes. And so it's very hard in some of these areas to actually get the funding that the county needs to provide the services that the county is required to provide.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
I just can't, on the screen, what are those two counties at the bottom with the highest rates? It's Wheeler and who else?
Wheeler and Sherman.
Sherman, okay, thanks.
Yeah, and Sherman is, they had a really low base at the time that Measure 50 was passed. Now Sherman is wind farm capital, right? So I don't even know that they're levying their full rate. And I think that they actually give a bit of a refund to their taxpayers every year because they bring in so much money from wind farms.
Hey, Mark, has
Yes.
has anyone run the numbers of what it would take if you, let's just pretend you wanted to stay revenue neutral, what rate would it take to make all of the counties equal?
I don't think that, I'm not aware of anybody who has run those numbers. And that's, you know, and that's an interesting notion. I think our preference, and I'll get to it at the end, is that we go to more of a levy-based system and we not have permanent rates at all. If taxpayers want to, if voters want to levy a tax on themselves, it'd be nice if they would be able to do that. So moving along here, I'm getting pretty close to my time. So we have limitations for Measure 50 on assessed values, limitations for Measure 50 on permanent rates, and then we have the Measure 5 limitations, right? We talked about this last time. This is the notion of compression, and so this graph just shows that compression still exists. We often think of compression more as being a problem when we're in a down economy and values are low, but compression still exists even in a good economy. If we could go to the next slide. This is what compression is, right? There are two limits. You take your maximum assessed value, or you take your assessed value, which is the lesser of maximum assessed value or real market value, times a rate. That gives you the tax that extended. And then you compare that to those Measure 5 limits of $5 per thousand for schools, $10 per thousand for general government. And if the Measure 50 calculation gives you a number that's higher than those Measure 5 limits, then the taxes are compressed down to get to those limits. First, we compress local option levies. Then we compress permanent rates, but we never compress capital bonds. Those never get compressed. They're considered outside of compression. So if we could go to the next slide. Here's a little history on what we've seen for compression. You know, think of this way. These taxpayers, especially on these local option levies, have decided to levy this tax on themselves, right? They want a better school building. They want a better, more operating money for their schools. They want their library to have better hours. But then because of these limitations for Measure 5, that money gets taken away and we see districts competing against each other. You may have a district where it's pretty much fully loaded right now. They're already hitting the limits. Then the voters say that they want to do a library district. Now everybody else in that district loses money. Every other district in that area loses money to make up for the fact that now you have a new district that still has to fit under that $10 cap. So it creates competition. The districts kind of cannibalize each other. And we've got some crazy examples of where they've gone back and forth, raising rates over the years. And then everybody gets pushed down and another district comes in and raises a rate. It really creates a mess if you're trying to give voters the ability to fund the services that they desire. Next slide. So one other thing that I have to talk about the property tax system is funding of the assessment and taxation system. We're in a bad spot right now. The red line is expenditures. This is how much money all the counties are spending in order to fund their assessors' offices. The blue line is what's known as CAFA, the County Assessment Function Funding Assistance Account. And CAFA is based off of primarily delinquent interest and recording fees. Those are flat, costs are going up, and the result is, if you could go to the next slide, particularly in counties with less than a $2 permanent rate, staffing levels are going down at the assessor's office. What's the result? Next slide. Property's not making it onto the roll. Here's an example. These folks pulled a permit for an agricultural building in Curry County. The picture on the right is what it looks like from the ocean side of it, and it's actually a really nice house. This would never be discovered unless the assessor is in front of the property, looking at it, boots on the ground. We have to get people out into the field. Here's another one. Next slide. This is Lane County. Little miscommunication between the assessor's office and the permitting office. This thing escapes taxation for a few years. Luckily, they were able to go back and claw back. You can always get current year +5 for omitted properties, something that you discover later that's on the roll. Next slide. This property, unfortunately, wasn't discovered for a long time. This property escaped taxation for many years, and they were able to claw back $4,300 for that current year +5, but they missed value between 2000 and 2010 that was amounting to $8,600 in taxes in Curry County, which is pretty significant for that county. And so as we think about property tax reform, we need to think about funding our assessors' offices. I think it's just a really important point. You can lose value all kinds of different ways. You can have people not reporting additions. You can have people who are businesses not reporting their personal property or under-reporting their personal property. You can have exemptions that are improperly applied for. All this work is a very manual process for the assessor's office. They need to get out into the field, and I think Jason kind of covered that. Last slide. Maybe the only good thing about Measure 50, all right? This is from the Department of Revenue Property Tax Statistics publication, a great one to read if you haven't. Our taxes are based off of the lower of these two lines, right? The red line is that assessed value line once Measure 50 came into place. The black line, you can see where it diverges, is the real market value. Now, but if we had been in a situation with permanent rates and we were taxing on that upper line, that black line, what would have happened during the housing crash? We would have seen budgets for districts go down 30%. Because we were on that lower line, that didn't happen. The districts were insulated from the effects of the housing crash for the most part. Not every district, this is a statewide number. But for the most part, we were mostly protected from that. Now, how can we go to a new system that's more based on real market values and not suffer and may just not have to do tremendous layoffs in the situation where we have real estate values decline? I think that we start at here we end right where Dr. Warner started, and that is that we really should consider a levy-based system, or we should consider some other means to make sure that as the real estate values go up and down, that we don't see terrible swings with the district's budgets. You will see budget cuts in the times when we most need government to spend, which is during a recession, and that would just be really bad for the economy. So this is what I had for you folks. Sorry if it was a little rushed, but I really appreciate the time, and I really am so happy that you folks are taking this up. I think it's a tremendously important issue, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all.
Wow, well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jason. So I was on the Revenue Committee for 5 years. I am not on it right now as the majority leader, but I know how geeky this is going to sound, but you can see that this is the kind of information that makes you understand why I'm dying to get back on the Revenue Committee. Because ultimately, a budget is a moral document. And the way we fund our budgets is through our tax policies. And therefore, our tax policies are moral proclamations of what we prioritize and what we value. And I think whether it was Michelle's discussion about some of the really horrific racist and white supremacy supporting history of our tax policy to Allison and Estelle's lived experience, where that they talked about, you can see that we have to, there's so many reasons we need to deal with this. The financial one almost seems like the least of it. However, that is what people pay the most attention to, right? The other interesting thing about tax reform, and particularly property tax reform, is very striking as you listen to the folks. I was particularly struck when I was listening to Allison and Estelle about the meetings where I've had where folks have come in, and I'm going to stereotype here, and I apologize in advance, where I've had some lovely, earnest West Side property owners come and talk to me because they are convinced that the only equities they see is, well, why are we paying more? We want reform so that our taxes will go down. Not seeing kind of the underlying basis by which their West Side whiter properties are higher, are taxed at a higher rate. So ultimately, what we all need focused on is there's a wide range of reasons to do this, and you are going to have a wide range of people who want different things out of it. And truly, there will be winners and losers. Even in a couple of presentations today, Mark and Jason's more kind of technical stuff, the different impacts in different cities and counties around the state, the different impacts between residential and commercial and industrial, having to take that. So our challenge is, how do we get to a place policy-wise that we have that has a solid anti-racist foundation, and that kind of I'm trying to think of the right thing, that has a base level of fairness, while acknowledging how do we balance fair with the need to respond to historical inequities, and realizing that fair is going to mean different things to different people who are impacted. So we need it to be defensible, I would say, morally and fairness wise, because there's going to be people who pay more and people who pay less. So I know a lot of folks are signing off because they have another meeting, so I didn't mean to quite to say quite that many sentences, but I did want to give folks the opportunity to have questions, either to bring up verbally or in the chat. I'm really eager. Commissioner Jayapal, if you want to remind folks what and how we're going to focus our conversation on our meeting next week, and maybe suggestions for folks to kind of think about and bring back, and we will send this out in our follow-up materials as well.
Absolutely. So just quickly, we're thinking of the next session as more of a working session. Chris Alanak is going to join us and essentially workshop a few concepts. So I would say that if there are particular concepts you're interested in, send them to us. The idea is not to be comprehensive. We can't possibly be comprehensive in an hour and a half, but just using that workshopping opportunity as a way to, again, flesh out the criteria. I mean, we've heard some of them. Majority Leader just ran through some of what the criteria ought to be. Our presenters have run through other criteria, but to perhaps break up into groups and talk about a set of concepts so that we flesh out what those criteria are, and then spend some time on you all thinking about what your next steps will be.
Great. And knowing that a number of folks have had to hop off, I do want to give, if there's specific questions, either for any of the presenters or just broadly, I want to give folks an opportunity for that. And thank you for there was some good back and forth with questions earlier on the chat. I haven't seen any other specific policy questions on there. I have the whatever this view is called, the gallery view. So if anybody wants to physically wave their hand or push a little raise your hand button on reactions, I'm happy to call on you. And I would like to call it, we had a couple other members, a number of my colleagues, Rep. Nathanson, Rep. Nose, both Rep. Sanchez all got on, as well as a couple other commissioners as well, and their staff. I believe Commissioner Myron was on, if I'm not mistaken, and at least one more. I'm completely blanking now. But. Okay, well, if there's not any questions, thank you all. Thank you again, particularly to Allison, Isabel, and Michelle for your presentations, and thank you, Mark and Jason. Jason, we really do have to work on your sound thing. I think your staff has been pretending to be participating in your online meetings and not actually. And Mark, it's always a pleasure. So I think that with that, I really look forward to people bringing that. Please bring. You'll get our outreach from this meeting. Respond to that with specific ideas about issues to workshop next week, and I'm really eager to continue these conversations. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.